Hi, let's get into our discussion of electricity. We are in Tzurba M'Rabanan, volume 22, the Lax family edition of all the volumes. This volume is sponsored by Dr. Harold and Magda Katz volume number 22. Continuing Hilchos Shabbos, such Lamaisa cases that we have here in our Tzurba series, and we are up to, in the volume, shiur number 3. Shiur Gimel, which is about the halachas of electricity and electric devices on Shabbos. Something that obviously will not be found in the Rishonim and the early Achronim, because it was before electricity was discovered, harnessed, however one wants to say it, but this is a great example of where the rabbis have to take the principles that were laid out already in the early sources, the Mishnah, the Gemara, the poskim. They take those same principles and then apply it to the new application. We know the halacha never changes. The applications of the halacha based on new realities are applied in new cases, and that's why we need our Gdolei poskim to tell us how to apply it. So what is it? How do we look at electricity? It's not something physical. It is physical. It's not physical when an electric current is completed. How do we look at that in halacha? For Shabbos, if I create an electrical current, is that an Issur D'Oraisa? Is that an Issur M'Rabanan? Is that nothing? Remember the Rav Ovadia Yosef has a tshuva. We might have mentioned this before when we discussed the Hilchos Borer, that he says, a question was I think it's in the first volume of the first tshuva in Yechav Adas, about making a birchas ha'ilanos on Shabbos. So some of the say, you can't, because the issue of making a bracha is being mevarer the nitzotzos, is separating the sparks of kedusha, and you can't be borer on Shabbos, so you can't make that bracha. So he says, okay, then you can't make any bracha on Shabbos. You can't eat on Shabbos because every bracha is mevarer the nitzotzos. So he says, no, it's not to be the Mishkan, right? Spirituality, you can't be violate malacha through a spiritual type of borer. So maybe you could say the same thing here. It's not physical. What is it? It's an electrical current. It's not doing the Mishkan. Maybe it's mutter. As we'll see, that is not what most poskim hold. Almost all poskim assume that there is an issue, there is a problem. Is it D'Oraisa, is it D'Rabbanan? That's the first issue we're going to talk about, page 119. Again, we're going to split this shiur into two parts. So first, the halachic basis for the prohibition of activating electricity. So it's known as, many call this the machlokas between the Chazon Ish and Rabbi Shalom Rosner. The Chazon Ish is the one that says creating and completing an electrical circuit is an Issur D'Oraisa. The Chazon Ish says in source number 1, you have in there at page 119, Od yesh bazeh mishum tikun mana. Since you create the current that should last for a very long time, karov hadavar dezeh boneh min haTorah. It's the malacha of boneh, of building. Ka'osa kli, like you make a kli, like you make an entire kli. V'kol sheken kan shekol achudim mechubarim labayis v'havi le kaboneh. And you might say there is a discussion we had that maybe there's only binyan the malacha boneh d'oraisa by something attached to the ground, but by a kli ain't binyan b'kelim. So first of all, many Rishonim said, if you remember, there is binyan b'kelim if you build the entire kli. You don't put it together, you build the entire kli. And number 2, says the Chazon Ish, maybe this is not kelim. Because it's attached to the ground when it's plugged in, that's called mechubar. V'yein kan mishum binyan b'kelim. Eladina kubachubar, says the Chazon Ish. T'yesh bo mishum binyan v'stira. Aval hachi nafkusa bazet afilu b'kelim ki agav nachajabot. Even if it's just kelim, it will still be boneh, as we just said, because if you make the whole kli, that's the discussion Rashi Tosas and Shabbos Daf Kuf Beis, it is going to be D'Oraisa. That's the Chazon Ish's shita, that creating and completing an electrical current is an Issur D'Oraisa of boneh or makah b'patish. Rav Shlomo Zalman did not think so. Rav Shlomo Zalman was very upset when he heard the psak of the Chazon Ish. He sent letters to him. He originally ruled that his elderly mother, he wrote that in a tshuva, in Beis Chafei, in source number 2, that Rav Shlomo Zalman said he let his elderly mother turn on and off her hearing aid on Shabbos, because turning it on, obviously you need it, but turning it off is because the battery is going to run out, and you don't want to hear it. So he assumes that why isn't it a problem? So he says because something that's meant to be done and undone can't be a malacha d'oraisa. Right? We've quoted that often, calling it derech tashmisho, mode of usage. Zippering something closed and then up. We assume that's not a problem. Why? The mode of usage. Glasses that are tinted. You go outside, they become sunglasses. You come back inside, not. Mode of usage. That's not real true soveya. A door. You close a door. Is that boneh? It's like putting a board into a hole in the wall? No. The door is meant to be opened and closed, opened and closed. So the electricity you turn it, you open it, then you close it, and you turn it, and you complete it, and you stop it. It says there Shlomo Zalman, that's why he doesn't think it's a daraisa. Let's read his words. Shlomo Zalman says in source number 2, Psak shel Rabbeinu Garam Litza'ar. He said the psak of the Chazon Ish caused him pain. More than 10 years, he says the Chazon Ish, Shlomo Zalman was a tremendous enough. He views the Chazon Ish as a gadol adoris, but you're going to make it so difficult than what I've been doing all these years. I've had 10 years worth of discussions with a certain posik in Yerushalayim who's not here anymore, and he finally was maskim to my words. She can't hear. And I allowed her l'shtamish b'Shabbos b'chonesh u'koletes kol medaber with a hearing aid, so a little telephone katan as he calls it. V'yitarnu l'ftoach v'liskar b'Shabbos v'yantif, and I allowed her to open and close it. B'sug zeh she'ein b'sham menaros, in one that doesn't have lights. We'll talk about v'gam ol hachnas ever b'Shabbos, not to put maybe the battery in, but just to turn it on and off. So he says, "V'achlanu az lo lachish bazel laka b'patush or tikkun mana," and I said it's not a problem of boneh or tikkun mana. Why? The tikkun mana hu dafka ksha tikkun hu bar kayama. Tikkun mana boneh or baka b'patush is when there is a true completion of an object, of a job that you leave there. Not where you're always going to undo it right after usage. Where it's meant to be opened and closed sporadically and intermittently, it's not going to be a malacha. And they have a back and forth. Rabbi Shalom Zalman says that even though he didn't understand the answer of the Chazon Ish, he didn't want to go against him. He said even the Chazon Ish would agree that adjusting the volume would be okay because it doesn't break a circuit. Either way, this is known as the machlokas or Chazon Ish and Shlomo Zalman. Shlomo Zalman would say at most it's a D'Rabbanan. The generation before in the Beis Yitzchak, he also discussed this, and he assumed it was an Issa D'Rabbanan. The Shuvas Beis Yitzchak, he assumed that it would be a D'Rabbanan. That Asker Bazebadin, source number 3, Ayidei Skira Zerem Ha'Electri, Nolad Koach Electri. Ze Aser B'Shabbos, he said it's molid, creation of something. Molid, remember molid we had by crushing ice, the Gemara has in Shabbos. Molid, creation. So you're creating something, but he doesn't assume it's an Isser D'Oraisa. Again, Shlomo Zalman does not think that this is sufficient to prohibit completing electrical currents. He does not think that molid, the example that the Beis Yisrael brings is you're creating a smell, a good smell. You put a clothing above strong spices with smoke, and the smoke goes up and is niklat, is absorbed into the garment. That's something tangible. But electrical circuits is not. But again, most others assume that it is an Isser D'Rabbanan. Rav Asher Weiss assumes that it is D'Oraisa, but not Dafka because of the Chazon Ish. Rav Asher Weiss, in source number 4, in Chelik Aleph of his Shuvas, he assumes it's Makam B'Patish, but for a different reason. Based on a Yerushalmi, there is a Yerushalmi in the 7th parak of Shabbos, that's the parak of Klal Gadol. All the malachas are listed. It says that the Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish came up with 39 malachas. 39 told us for each malacha, but the way he reads the Yerushalmi is that the Rabbanan, there are certain activities that the Rabbanan knew are going to be asur on Shabbos. This is a productive malacha, and then they went to figure out which malacha is it going to be in. Which malacha does it fit into? And if it didn't fit into any other malachas, other 38, it became Makam B'Patish. Makam B'Patish is like the catch-all. It's based on Rishonim. There's a Rashi, there's a Ramban. But says the Rav Asher Weiss in source number 4, V'im ha'maisa yesh bo meleches machsheves. Av shelo matzu bo tzadimyon l'malacha kol shehi. Even though it's not specifically connected in like a different malacha, kavu sheyesh bo makam b'patish. They said it's makam b'patish. U'malacha zud makam b'patish geder klaliyu. Makam b'patish is more of a general. L'chol malacha sheyesh bo chashivas gedola v'tikkun yitzira. To any malacha that has a certain type of chashivas. And then you figure out which malacha it is. So says Rav Asher Weiss, this completion of a circuit which has unbelievable power, unbelievable potential. It can affect the whole world. There's nothing like it that has been constructive. To move the earth. Rishonim Zalman would say back, yeah, it's constructive and it's unbelievable. That doesn't make it into a malacha. If it's not something tangible, it's not meant something to be permanent. So either way, this is a machlokas, so Rav Asher Weiss agrees to the Chazon Ish that's the Araisa, but below mitame. So Lamaisa, all poskim assume that it's usur. Electricity is usur. Some say D'Oraisa. and some say d'Rabbanan. But that is purely electricity. It gets complicated more where there is or, where there is light. Incandescent lights and heating elements, where there is a metal filament that is heated, sometimes to glow. So that is another malacha. If you look in the Rambam tells us in Hilchos Shabbos, in Perek Tes, the top of page 123, Rambam tells us that melting metal or heating metal until it becomes charcoal is a told of cooking. You're cooking the metal. Says the Rambam, hametich, somebody who melts some type of metal through fire, or you just heat the metal until it becomes hot coal. So heating metal until it glows like a coal is bavashal. The Rambam elsewhere says that heating iron or copper to purify it, to put it then into water, is a tolda of mavir, of burning, a different malacha. Rambam says in Hilchos Shabbos Perek Yud Beis, "Hamachamim es habarzel kadei letzarfo b'mayim." If you're machamim in order to purify it in water, that is told us mavir v'chayev, and then one is going to be chayev for that. The Ravid argues he thinks they both should be mavashel and not mavir. The Magen Mishnah defends the Rambam that the bishul is only. Bishul does not apply to something that itself is fire. It has to be something that's heated by fire. That's what the Magen Mishnah seems to say in source number 8. Arguing on the Ravid. But either way, there's a malacha here that's being done by heating the metal. So what about applying to incandescent lights? Again, not the LEDs, where nothing gets hot. But Shlomo Zalman assumes that he quotes several achronim, Avnei Nezer, Merkeres HaMishnah, that even according to the Rambam, Mavir is only, this is before we get to the Lamaisa, I'm sorry, I jumped the gun. Maybe Mavir, the lighting the fire, is only when, like the Rambam says, Kedei letzarfo b'mayim. If your kavana is to purify it in water, that's when it's going to be daraisa. And that doesn't apply. Electric lights don't want to purify anything. So maybe it shouldn't be daraisa. So Shlomo Zalman's Chiddush, L'Kula, in source number 9, he quotes the Chazon Ish. And then he quotes from Achronim, like the language of the Rambam. Why does the Rambam quote that kavana if you don't need that? The Avnei Nezer himself argues on this, and he assumes that why should it make a difference? This is a malacha, this is a malacha. It's not a correct diuk, and heating metal until it glows for any useful purpose, for any constructive purpose, is going to be the malacha da'oraisa of mavir. And therefore, even though Shlomo Zalman was making mitzad electricity by itself, but turning on an incandescent light is da'oraisa for mavir, lighting a fire. Says Shlomo Zalman in source number 10. Ulanias daiti tzarech ian. And Shlomo Zalman was an expert sheba expert. He wrote svarim on electricity and halacha. Eich efshar lechalek. Bein miskaven letzaref and bein miskaven levashal lahayir. What difference should it make? Whether you're heating it to purify or to cook and to light. Bo bizman sha'avaris eish letzarech chimum bishol. V'ar harbe yoser matsui mi'avar amnas letzaref. It's much more common not to do it letzaref nowadays. I say it's only, it's this is the most common usage. In the olden days, it was just dafka letzarif. That's why it was said, but it shouldn't be. That's the only kavana for mafir. And therefore, Shlomo Zalman says at the end of the tshuva, source number 10, at the end, kivan shachut shebesocha menorah mischamim harbe ma'od. The metal inside the menorah is burning hot. Shu malbinu mefitz or kol shegin the chashiv shinu tvei v'chayev shapir mishum mavir. So lamaisa, electricity is a machlokes daraisa d'Rabbanan. The lights were machmer to assume that if it's incandescent. That's what the Menuchas Ava summarizes. Moshe Levi, Aser b'Shabbos lahafil shum machshir chashmali. Lamaisa, you can't turn on anything, any electrical appliance. Beinim hu pa'al aydei zerem chashmal ragil. Whether it's with a regular electrical current, beinim pa'al aydei solas chashmalios, or batteries. Doesn't matter if it's plugged in or batteries. Mishum shaham maf'il es hamachshir yotzer ma'agal chashmali, because the one who turned it on completes an electrical circuit. And there's new currents in the item. Some say it's daraisa bona. That was the base yislach that we saw. A d'Rabbanan umikomakom. That's daraisa d'Rabbanan. But still, if it has fire, if it has a light, because mavir, according to many poskim. According to all of this, what would you say if there is a stoppage and there's no electricity coming in? Are you allowed to unplug something if there's no electricity? Electricity. When electricity supply is off due to a Shabbos clock, either a Shabbos clock or a power outage, can you unplug the appliance because you don't want it to go back on? So the Shmir Shabbos says yes with a shinui, because the plug is muksa. So you have to move it with a shinui, but if there's no electricity, they're not doing anything. What are you doing? You're preventing it from going on. You are continuing and extending the status quo. That's okay. You can't plug something in because that would be gram hadlaka. That's indirectly lighting something. That's causing a change in the status quo if you're going to plug it in. A gram, an indirect change in the status quo, because it's going to be delayed, but it's still gram is also D'Rabbanan on Shabbos. If it's going to go on right away, that's a Malacha D'Oraisa. But in terms of unplugging it so it doesn't go on, that's continuing a status quo, which we know is mutter. It says the Shmir Shabbos. Where the electrical current is not going in, source number 12, mutter lahozi as hateka. You could take out the plug. Sometimes on a weekday you also take it out minasheka. Kidei or push all the same thing would be pushing all the things down on the Shabbos clock so it doesn't go on. So that when the electrical current comes in, you're not changing anything. Use your elbow. So don't touch muksa b'yadayim. Ubishas sarach gadol. Sarach gadol. What would that be? You have to figure out what sarach gadol is to plug in, meaning violating an issa d'Rabbanan of grama. Again, yish lishol she'elas chacham. Ad kan, part 1. Background of our electrical discussion. Daraisa d'Rabbanan, and if there's a light, it makes it worse. So now let's start some of the applications. Refrigerators is a big topic. As we know, when it first came out 100 years ago, there was a lot of discussion. Do you have to wait till you hear the motor on to open the fridge? So let's even start even before that. If there's a light on in the fridge, and there's a light on in the fridge, but when I open the door, I'm only when I open the door, I don't care about the light. That's called psik reisha. Psik reisha means if what you're doing is vadig and the cause of malacha to be done, it's still asur, it's all asur d'oraisa. Right, it's more malach shen sriach legufa. We mentioned is machlokes. Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda. Most Rishonim poskim is d'Rabbanan. Psik reisha. You have no kavana for the light, but it's vada going to happen. So that is usher. Usher. What's the only way to do it? In the days of old, we'll see not the refrigerators today. Sometimes if the refrigerator goes off, you don't hear it on, and you could determine that there's nothing going on in the fridge. Nothing's on. So then maybe it'll be like what we just said. You could unplug the fridge. So then it won't go on. Meaning, let's say you left the light on. How can you get your food out? So I'll wait till it's off, and then I'll unplug it. You won't be able to plug it back in. I mean, if you have another fridge to put everything in. I don't think most people would want to unplug their fridge if you don't have, because if you have another one, you can. But, says the Shmir Shabbos, Bizman said we don't have that anyway. But again, that was a possibility. Possibility was, Shachach, source number 13, Shachal Hotzi Asanu Ravu Zakal B'Yosar Lochal Shemem Karer. I really need the food in the fridge, but I forgot to turn the light off. Yotzi, so better than opening up the door? No. Yotzi katan, he says a katan, if need be a gadol b'shinui. Shows a katan, the teka hamachaber samakar lazerem chashbali. Undo it when it's off. The yasakim b'shasha makar sagur ve'eno muf'al. When it's not muf'al at all, and then you can't do it. B'cholo fan lo yoshav l'chaber samakar lazerem chashbali. You can't plug it back in. It might turn on right away. I mean, if it waits a little bit, it's still going to be grama, unless there's, but again, even that is not so simple. But that was in the days of old. Nowadays, he points out here, even with the simple models, the refrigerator does not fully cease functioning at any point. So disconnecting the refrigerator from the power supply is prohibited. It is usher, says the Shmir Shabbos, 14. Bekarim ke'ela shamanoah shalem muf'al b'ofan kavua. Ve'eno mafsik lefo. Doesn't stop. Gam b'shashem makari sagur. Even if you don't hear it on, there's something on. There's something on inside. So that ain't kol heter lasos apulos and his cars. You can't do any of that. Can't do any of that. So, what do you do? So, if the light is on, nothing to do. Maybe we'll talk about getting a guy. But what if you're not sure if the light is on? Not sure. Did I turn it off? Erev Shabbos was so crazy and busy. I don't remember if I turned it off, so I'm not sure if it's on or not. So you can't play games with this. Meaning, it has to be if you're only really not sure. If there's a real suffix, so that's called suffix psik reisha, or psik reisha l'sha'avar. Right? It's a suffix, meaning usually psik reisha is a suffix of the future. I'm not sure if dragging this bench would cause holes. That's Rav Shimon Kaved versus psik reisha. But here, the Metzias is there. Either the light's on or not. I just don't know. So the Taz talks about this. You're allowed to close a little box, the Taz says, even though there might be flies in there, and you might be trapping. But that's okay. That's also called the Rishonim Miskave. That's what the Taz says in Zion by the flies. Afilum Tomar 15. To bevade ave psik reisha v'aser michol makom besafikim yesham zvuvim. You're not sure if there is zvuvim bugs there. Yesh lahatir tosham ein psik reisha. That's not called psik reisha. That's called safek psik reisha, which is called davar she'ein miskave. This is really a major machlokas. The Taz, there's a Rabbi Kiva Eger in Yeredeya based on a Ramah, but this is a machlokas. And there are those that say that one can't open the fridge then if you're really not sure. The problem is you're not going to be able to close it. Not going to be able to close it because let's say the light is on. When you opened it, it was davar she'ein miskavein. You had the heter of safek psik reisha. But now that it's open, what are you going to do? Okay, if you want to leave it open the rest of Shabbos, that's fine. If you're taking that chance. But Shmir Shabbos says, Savik biyado 16 emotzi o nita kazanura, v'kedem nita kazafalas maris hashmal, yishmakam lahakel, v'yishmir poskim shemachmirim, so Machmir, as I just said, it's not that Savik psik reisha is going to be mutter. Good, so you can take it out, but you can't close the fridge. Rav Malamed says maybe put a towel there. Oh, it just closed by accident. No, don't. You can't play around. The Pnei Halacha says in Pasach Hazem Karev Menorah Dinitzlaka, the light is on. Mutar lo zimen machal. You can take the food out. V'lo yiskar es dalas hamakarev. You can't close the door. There's something's going to happen to the fridge, so don't open it. Don't open it. El yaniach sham magavet kadesh lo tisaga lagamrei, so it doesn't close totally. V'chein anur lo tchai. You can close it a little bit in a way that the light doesn't go off. The light doesn't go off. If you keep it in that way, then you could use the rest of Shabbos. If it's close enough that the stuff won't go bad, but you can't close it the whole way. Another issue, besides the light, obviously with refrigerators, is the thermostat. Because refrigerators go on and off, the motor. So once it reaches a certain temperature, then it goes off, and then when it gets warmer, so then the thermostat's going to kick in the motor. So when you open the fridge, that's going to cause warm air to go into the fridge. Do I have to worry about that? Warm air is going to go in the fridge, causing the thermostat to cause the motor to go on. So this was the big issue in 100 years ago, and more recently. Or Mordechai Eliyahu says, yeah, you got to wait till the motor's on, and then you can open it, because that's continuing the status quo, as we said, that the motor continues to be on, but that's not a malacha. Yesh leftoach, source 18, Kol Eliyahu, Esam Karer, Rak Shamanoa Oved, only when it's on. Kivach in Poschok She'ena Oved, because if you open it when it's not on, you're going to cause it to go on faster. Yotzei Miyama Karer, Kor, right, cold will go out. V'nichnas Chom, warmth will go out. V'amakar Maskelavod, V'einzu, Grama Ela Garmi. He calls that Garmi, which is a little more direct than Grama. So that's Rav Mordechai Eliyahu. Rav Avadia holds, and many poskim other hold, Me'ikra din is mutter. It's so many stages. It's not mamish a grama. It's the opposite. It's not worse than grama garmi. It's less than grama. It's less than grama. There are so many. It's grama to grama to grama. Warm air is going to go in, cause the thermostat. So many different stages. Klala Ola says Rav Avadia in the first volume of Yabia Omer. Shemutel of Torah Telas Hamakaber Chashmali b'Shabbos. You can open the door of the fridge. V'yafal pikein Rav Nachman Shel Poskim Shashu Poel. He says you got to be machmer, be machmer. But again, the minhag olam is to be makel. Rav Henkin in Eidos Yisrael, in source 20. Rabbi Yosef Eliyahu Henkin says one could open it for a without the motor being on. Basically, he calls this a psik reisha al yedei grama. Even if you want to call it, the motor's going to go on, the motor's for sure going to go on, but it's only going to go on not right away. Not right away. So it's psik reisha al yedei grama, which we learned a couple years ago when we did the klalim, that's mutter. Psik reisha al yedei grama is mutter. We spoke about getting the water off the top of the sukkah that first hits the cement and then goes onto the grass, that's mutter. Psik reisha adei grama is mutter. So too here, it's psik reisha that the motor is going to go on, but it's adei grama, and therefore it is allowed. He says there, psik reisha delo nichale cholkim raboseinu v'amanazeu rak psik reisha beis ha'peula. Right away. Avok psik reisha ba bizman acher u'b'makam acher v'nikar kla beis ha'peula ein kan machlokes. That is the kula that the minhag ha'olam is to rely on, not to wait till the motor is on. One wants to, great, but the Verbiat also explains it. Opening the door of a fridge while the motor is not running is a subject of halacha controversy. Warm air is drawn in, causes the thermostat to activate the compressor of a chulu. So it's a chain of events. Warm air is drawn in, turning on the thermostat to react and activate the compressor. The act of opening up the door is the initial act, but there are many other steps, and therefore, once you follow their posik, but definitely the minhag olam seems to be more lakula. There are other issues with opening up a fridge and the new types of sensors. So if one has a Shabbos mode, obviously that's good. If not, one just has to research to make sure that everything is kosher with the fridge. The Aruch HaShabbos summarizes many of these halachas in source 23. Remember the Aruch Shabbos or Reuben from Yerushalayim today. If somebody's going to buy a refrigerator or a freezer, you have to research, meaning do these types and models have any issues? You have to ask somebody who's a baki. What you could also do is to set your, you're going to want to use the fridge in the morning hours. So if you have one of these refrigerators, you can put the whole thing on a Shabbos clock, and it's going to go off when you use it, then it's going to go back on an hour later. After, how much is it going to get warm if you keep the fridge closed the whole time? So that's what he says. One can do that, but otherwise one has to be very careful about using it. So he says towards the bottom, if you put a shon Shabbat on the outlet, no problem, because this pu'ula doesn't cause anything with the hafalas hamanoah. Okay, whatever it is, that's what you can do. And again, we'll talk about in the future shiurim about Amir La'akim. We never had a shiur per se about Amir La'akim. We've mentioned him. We'll talk about if you open the fridge, could you get a guy to open it? Could you get a guy to close it? So we'll have to talk about that. One final topic for today's shiur, and then we'll finish this next time, and that is page 134, heaters, air conditioners, and fans. So again, these are also electricity. So what's the halacha? Again, you can't turn on a fan or a heater or a air conditioning. But the Shulchan Aruch says one can do Amir La'akum. You could ask a guy to light a fire for young children or even for adults. There's a line in the poskim, Hakol chola meitza latzina. Everybody's chola when it comes to the cold. And therefore, it says the Shulchan Aruch, Reisha and Vav, Ba'artzos karas in the cold lands. Right? He didn't know about cold lands. He was sitting there in Tzfat. But he says in the cold lands, in Europe, or more north, Mutter la'eno Yehudi, la'asos medura. A non-Jew can make a fire, b'shvil ha'ktanim, u'mutar nagdolim m'schamim bo, for the children, and the gdolim could also be warmed by it. V'yafilu b'shvil ha'gdolim mutter imer kar gadol, and even if it's very cold, the gdolim could also use it. Sha'kol cholim eitzel ha'kor. Everybody has a chol for the car. V'lo kotem shnogim heter afal pi she'ina kar gadol b'yamahu. Right? Now, the practice of some is even when it's not so cold. No, only when it's cold. The Shmir Shabbos says the same thing in the other direction. Not just Hakol Cholam Eitzel HaKor, Hakol Cholam Eitzel HaChom. And therefore, you can turn on a fan or an air conditioning. B'yemos HaKayetz HaChamim, source 25. Shachom Me'ika LaAdam, when the heat is very difficult and uncomfortable. Mutter Lo Melanachri Lafil Tamavrer. Right? Ventilator. Or Tamazgan, or the air conditioning. Or the opposite. What if it's too cold? You can have him turn it off. Right, all of that is included. Rav Yashiv and Rav Moshe Mordechai Karp are not convinced that you'd say the same thing with cold and hot. Cold, you can really get sick. Hot, you're uncomfortable. They don't think that it is a parallel in source 26. Vatam by cold, alula gilidei choli. Avol sharavu tsar ba'alma. So they don't think that's enough, but we'll have to return to that by Amir La'akum. If the fan is facing in one direction, so that's called the Kli Shemalach L'Isser, and you are allowed to move it in a different direction. If you want to L'Tzorach Gufa, L'Tzorach L'Komo. And that's what the Shmir Shabbos points out. That's okay, as long as you don't change anything electrical. Right? You can change the direction it's flowing in. You can change if it's oscillating or not, if it's purely mechanical to pick the thing up and down. That's mutter. That's mutter. But obviously not to create or disconnect any units and any currents. Ach mutter l'taltel in source 27. Mutter l'taltel ach l'shanos. You can move, you can change. It's kivun ha'maver, the direction, or a radiator or a heating element, a radiator. L'kivun ha'manochim l'mishtamesh. You want to have it blowing more in another direction. Beinim sorach losos or a gufo shaladam or a gufo. You want it to blow on you. Or shorach l'komo. Or you need the place with a machshir, and you're allowed to put something in that spot if you want to move it, as we've said. V'yizar shel yafsek ezer machashmal. Make sure you don't change or affect the current by moving it. But mazgan shepoel, also he says in the continuation, you're allowed to, sometimes the openings on the air conditioning is a little too cold, you want to close the things on top so that it doesn't blow so hard. That also you're allowed to do. So any of that is allowed. Some talk about if it's a heating element, something that's considered fire, and therefore would not be able to be moved on Shabbos. So that is some type of fan heater or an electrical oven, right? It says here in the footnotes, right? That might be called fire. That you can't move fire on Shabbos. That's not just a Kli Shemalach L'Isser. Okay, we'll have to stop here. We'll have to talk more about electric sensors. You're walking home and your neighbor has an electric sensor. How much you have to walk around that? How difficult has to be? What about electricity in hotels, with cards, Shabbos elevators? That will all come up in the next year.